Well, hello to everyone tuning in on Zoom, and welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill political panel. I'm Robin Browne, your co-host for this month's Off the Hill, and I'm joining you as always from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I am joined tonight by my regular co-host, Libby Davies. Hello, Libby.
Hi, Robin. Thanks very much. And hello, everybody. I'm Libby, and I'm joining you from the unceded territory and the ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish peoples.
All right. Thank you, Libby. Well, tonight we're talking about whiteness. What is it? Where did it come from? And how does it affect or impact federal policy? Now, we know some of you folks out there might be thinking, hey, it's Black History Month. So why are we focusing on whiteness? Well, it's because Blackness and whiteness are so connected. They're like two sides of the same coin, but we rarely take a close look at the white side. Canadian media theorist Marshall McLuhan said, "We don't know who discovered water, but we know it wasn't a fish." So just like fish in water, we're all so immersed in whiteness that it becomes invisible. But tonight's panel is about making it visible. And with us tonight to shed some light on this topic are Beisan Zubi, a Palestinian Canadian who specializes in equity, anti-oppression, and organizational transformation. Hey, Beisan, welcome back. Poet, journalist, professor, and activist living in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Elle Jones. Elle, welcome back. And assistant professor in the University of Regina's Faculty of Social Work, Fritz Pino. Fritz, this is your first time joining us, so welcome. And thank you all, folks, for joining us. Also, welcome to all of you watching on Zoom. We encourage you to participate in the chat and polls and ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function, and we'll do our best, as always, to address your questions. So I'll now pass it over to Libby to get us started.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Robin. And to open the discussion, I'd like to begin with a fairly big question to all of you, our panelists, and that is, what is whiteness? So let's start with Beisan, and then we'll go to Elle and then to Fritz. So Beisan, get us going. What do you think whiteness is?
Oh, I was dreading being called on first for this one because I was hoping to be able to add to the insights of the other panelists rather than for them to have to add mine, because my relationship with whiteness is very complicated because I grew up in very white spaces. And for a long time, it sounds terrible to say, but I almost prided myself on ethnic ambiguity. So people not being able to know what my actual ethnicity was. For the record, I'm Palestinian, and I grew up in a place where I was basically the only Palestinian. My family were the only Palestinians that I knew, and so I have had to actually unlearn whiteness and unlearn the way that invisibility of whiteness is just kind of taken as the forest for the trees in a white settler colonial society like Canada is, right? And so unlearning whiteness has been, I think, the depth of my kind of interactions with it, because of how I came to understand that I was indoctrinated and that I was not being true to myself. So for me, whiteness is not even really one single thing. It's almost the absence of racialization. It's the absence of having these racial stereotypes, identities, whatever it is, imposed on you by the rest of society. And so one thing that I was thinking about was how, for example, Irish immigrants, when they first came to North America, were viewed as non-white. They were viewed as others. They were racialized in a way that now, to think about Irish people, you would think about them as white. And so for me, whiteness isn't really about what your race actually is. It's about how you are interacting with racism and interacting with the systems of racism in our society. So whiteness is almost an absence of racial pressure, racial identity, racial discrimination. It's the privilege of living without that. And so I think that's kind of where I have landed, but I just really was so excited to hear from the other panelists on their framing of it, because I do know that there's so much you know, there's so many different ways of experiencing it and understanding it. So this is going to be an interesting.
Yes, it's going to be a very interesting discussion. And Beisan, I really appreciate your frankness as always. You're always very open and clear about what you feel and how you've been learning things. And it certainly, I mean, whiteness is something that's been evolving, and you've demonstrated that very well, even historically, and how you've been learning as what it is and what it's about. So thank you for that. Elle, we'll move on to you. I know you've got lots of thoughts and experience on this issue.
Yeah. So I think what Beisan identified is really key, that when you talk about whiteness, people want to individualize it to white people and then say, oh, you're saying that I as a white person, etc. But we know that people of many races uphold white supremacy, for example. We're seeing this at the UN right now. Through a lot of foreign policy right now, you have Ahmed Hussein cutting funding to UNRWA. You know, all the US ambassadors that are voting against a ceasefire are Black. And so one could suggest that even though they are Black, they are participating in a system of whiteness. And some people have, for example, extended that to Barack Obama and said that, you know, Barack Obama, while he was racially Black, effectively performed whiteness as the head of the US empire. So when we're talking about whiteness in that sense, we're not even specifically talking about an individual racial identity. We're talking about a system of power. And a specific historical system of power. So as Beisan indicated, historically, whiteness is an invention, and it's a construction that is, in fact, relatively recent. So as a meaningful category, if you went back into, say, 1700, what that would mean is not the same thing as we would mean now. And so how we think of whiteness consolidates really around the turn of the 20th century. That's where you really start in response, for example, in North America, so in response to overseas wars. So in the US, the different kind of categories of white people, you have, okay, WASP at the top, and Catholics are less, and Irish are less, and Slavs are less. That starts to consolidate in response to wars in Samoa and the Philippines abroad, and of course, the extermination and genocide of indigenous people and land grabs at home. And in that sense, you therefore need all hands on deck. So people are promoted into a sense of, okay, there's a white identity, and as a political identity, that therefore allows us to consolidate power. So it's really about a relationship to political power that we're speaking about. And I think that can be difficult for people to comprehend, because we do, of course, tend to individualize discussions of race. Oh, you're calling me racist. Oh, wait, you're saying Barack Obama isn't Black? Well, no one's saying that, but we're saying that politically, we can speak about how he participates in white supremacy. We can talk about how this is something we quite frequently see now, that as people enter the halls of power and they become more diverse, we have more diverse groups of people upholding settler colonialism or white power structures. So I think that political framing is what we really want to emphasize.
Yeah, well, that's a lot to take in, and I really appreciate you sort of getting into that. And as you mentioned, how much do you think folks kind of understand this debate about whiteness, that it isn't about individualized, you know, whether you're Black or white, or how it is related to power? Is that something that is much more recent, that people are now, broadly speaking, beginning to understand what it means?
No, I think it's because we also have inflammatory discussions about race. So I think what we've actually seen is in backlashes to CRT/DEI/affirmative action / like whatever's the word of the day. You now frequently get a discourse like, white people are the only people you can attack. White people are the most oppressed people. You can say anything about white people. So almost the designation of whiteness as an oppressed identity, or the idea that in speaking about whiteness, one is performing some kind of political some kind of personal targeted attack that's being mean, rather than identifying a relationship to these historical trends in relationship to power. So I think it becomes an inflammatory discussion, not because it needs to be, but because, of course, politically, people want to hold on to this power and privilege, right? That at the very moment where a lot of people sense that their historical power is waning, that other groups are being admitted into the fold, as they would put it, you know, like somehow unfairly. Therefore, we have to defend this idea that, you know, white people are oppressed, and white people uphold this idea of Western culture, and white people are civilized, and, you know, white people are the rational, intellectual inheritors of, and so it's attached to all these other very powerful ideas, and people get quite upset when you begin to unpack that.
Oh, thank you. And I'll bring you in now, Fritz, and thank you so much for joining us today on Rabble Off the Hill. And I know you've written about this subject of whiteness, and it's something that you've looked at. So just sort of as a general question as to Beisan and to Elle, how do you see the question of whiteness, and how have you approached it in your research and your writing and your experiences?
Well, I totally agree with Beisan and Elle in terms of their articulation of whiteness, and it's very, very much important to consider how it is seen as a form of power, and how people are relegated to this kind of power to assert certain forms of oppression. So a little bit of a history about myself. I grew up in the Philippines, and when I moved to Canada, that's the only time I have come to encounter the word whiteness, right? And I said, what is whiteness? What does this really mean? And then it was actually coming from anti-racist and critical race scholars that I've read and was introduced upon, and to learn about that particular word, because it's like whiteness, but is it just a color, or is it just a kind of concept? But when I dig deep to it, and especially when I did my dissertation on older Filipino gay men, which actually to me is an intervention to the whiteness in the different fields of studies. So I look at queer LGBTQ studies, which has been critiqued by queers of color because of the prominence of whiteness in that field. The field of gerontology, aging, which is very much governed by whiteness ideology and white bodies being seen as the subject of analysis and the standard and measures. So I have come to understand then that, whiteness is really this force, this unwritten norm, what queers of color seen as the given, which is being naturalized all over again. And I like the idea that Elle mentioned that, anyone like BIPOC bodies could perpetuate whiteness, could reiterate it, could reinforce it all over again, and until we kind of, like what Beisan said, unlearn and resist from it. And I think about the Philippines as well, where we are very much indoctrinated with a very kind of like colonial mentality, where we are told to uphold whiteness, to see the West as the greener pasture, as this like savior of our economic hardships. So that's why we moved here. We migrated for that promise of migration. And so we even think about the advertisements and media that continues to promote whiteness, even using different kinds of products to whiten one's skin. It's very much clear in the Philippine context. So whiteness there is also globalized. It is it's a form of imperialism that continue to uphold white supremacy. And I would continue to say, like, uphold white bodies while marginalizing others.
Mm-hmm. And very much, I think what you said is picking up on Robin's point that it is invisible because it's so taken for granted that we don't even think about it. So hence why we're taking a look at this subject tonight and sort of trying to unpack about what's really going on and how we just sort of buy into this notion. And it's good to challenge what's going on and to see how things are evolving. So over to you, Robin. A good opening from everybody.
Yes, no, thank you, everybody. And just picking up on what Fritz said, in November of 2021, my family went to Ghana because my stepdaughter married a Ghanaian brother, and we went to a market, and they were selling lots of skin lighteners in the market there, just like over here, right? So from that point. Over to Elle. Elle, in July 2017, you made national news as one of the people targeted by a Cape Breton, Nova Scotia far-right group who posted your names online, calling you all, quote, dangerous because you showed interest in protests calling for the removal of a statue of the founder of Halifax, Edward Cornwallis. Now, the background on that is that after white supremacist Dylan Roof killed 9 Black people in a Charleston, South Carolina church in 2015, a movement emerged calling for the removal of statues and memorials that were seen to glorify slavery and a colonial past. Now, and by July 2017, this included calls to remove the statue of Edward Cornwallis from Halifax Park, led by members of the Mi'kmaq First Nation, the first residents of the area, who said the statue symbolized the colonial injustices they'd suffered up to the present day. So in a CBC article about this whole thing, the Cape Breton Far Right group targeting you, you said, quote, people often support whiteness unthinkingly. What did you mean by that?
I mean, I had completely forgotten about this until you guys brought this up.
That's what we do.
So I couldn't even begin to say what I was thinking or talking about at that time. It seems so long ago. I think interestingly enough, to sort of elaborate on the context, first of all, I believe it was in 2015 that there was a ceremony on Canada Day that Mi'kmaq women did at that statue about missing a murdered Indigenous woman, and that was invaded by Proud Boys. And that was actually one of the first kind of public performances of the Proud Boys. And so when I look back at these kind of moments, they were really presaging a lot of what we now understand about, you know, the so-called rising right in Canada, or the growth of the right wing. And you asked me this question, I was kind of thinking backwards. And of course, the response at the time, these are members of the military that marched with the ensign up to the statue to disrupt the ceremony, you know, to sort of defend Cornwallis and then defend Canada Day. So the idea that this ceremony by Indigenous people was, you know, disrespecting Canada in some way. And this was, I said, probably a very early example of white supremacy in the military, which now is, you know, fairly well understood. There's been studies on it, but at the time, you know, it was like, oh my gosh, what's happening? The Proud Boys people weren't really aware of the formation of these groups. So this was almost like the canary in the coal mine for a lot of this in Canada. And I say this to just say the response at the time was very much around whether or not we were calling for them to be removed from the military and whether or not we were wrong for doing so. So at this kind of turning point where we had this public that will now, you know, now is acknowledged as this huge security threat. There's white supremacists, like, and high percentages in the military. You know, we have all these white supremacist groups that are forming. You know, we had these groups present at the convoy. We've had them present in all kinds of acts of political terrorism in the United States in particular. But the question was, oh no, like, here's these Black and Indigenous people, and are you calling for them to lose their jobs? Is this cancel culture? So it was really like placed upon us to have some kind of correct response, and whether or not we were kind of disruptive in our response. And that exemplifies probably what I was speaking about in that quote. So the reason why I said I sort of forgot about this incident is because it's interesting in a way that was national news, because it's kind of like sexy, like, oh, a bunch of Nazis put you on a list. But it was actually very minor blip in the terms of things that have actually impacted my well-being or employment. So it was visible in a particular way, but also meaningless, because everybody went, oh, Nazis, like, that's really bad and really stupid. But, you know, saying Free Palestine has had a lot more impact on my life in terms of tangible loss of jobs than Nazis. And this sounds like I'm making a kind of strange comparison, but I'm saying that, you know, other things that I have done, being in solidarity with Indigenous people in general, has been very threatening to aspects of my life. Certainly calling out elite members of my own community for, you know, allying with forces of power against the interests of Black people. All those things have had much more of a traumatic impact on me than Nazis putting me on a list. But because that seems such a visible and easy way to think about race, or you got targeted by Nazis, it was sort of easy for that to become national news. But the many, many ways in which when we speak about race or are activists or advocate and we are put in real danger are not usually acknowledged. So I think that also says that we have, again, a kind of like very juvenile and simple view of how this works. So Nazis bad. But of course, the many ways that you won't get employment because you've stood up on an issue of immigration will not be visible in the same way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, thanks very much, Ellen. Now just turning to Fritz, I know that in December 2021, you co-authored a paper on how COVID-19 measures in schools magnified inequities for school settlement workers and newcomer students in Canada, in prairie schools particularly. Now, one of the themes that you examined was whiteness and races, and I'm just wondering what did you find out in the paper that you co-authored and the research that you did? What did you find out? And are there any parallels that you can draw for us to, I don't, looking at schools, but can you draw to the federal level?
Thanks for the question. So when you think about whiteness and racism in the context of the experiences of school settlement workers and school settlement workers, these are settlement workers who are assigned to go to different schools to provide settlement services for newcomer families and refugees. So they go there, do an outreach and support and families who are new to Canada. And most of the settlement workers who are doing their job, this work, are immigrants, racialized immigrants themselves. So what we found out, we really borrowed or draw from the theorization of Sarah Ahmed. And Sarah Ahmed, names, whiteness as a brick wall. And I'm actually pulling out the research here, and I'm gonna read this quote. So for Ahmed, for those who are not white, whiteness can be experienced as a wall, something solid, a body with mass that stops you from getting through. So we use that kind of analysis to really name some of the barriers and challenges of settlement workers in schools during COVID-19, whereby their knowledge and presence were devalued by schools. They experienced subtle and blatant forms of racism, especially during COVID-19. The anti-Asian racism has also been heightened. So that piece is something that, we could see that white supremacy continues even in the provision of social services and in the ways in which schools consider newcomers and new immigrants in the country. So connecting that to a federal policy, I'm thinking more of the history of immigration in Canada, like especially the history of Asians in Canada. So we can think about the Chinese Exclusion Act, Magato Maro incident, the Japanese internment. So how these particular kinds of racism, anti-Asian racisms, were already existent within the immigration policy, and that continues to trickle down to shape the mindset of of people in the contemporary moment, especially during COVID-19, where it is easy for folks to link Asian immigrants as carriers of COVID-19. And we see a lot of the rise of hate crimes against Asian people of Asian descent, and also people who are embodying a non-white identity.
And have you been able to draw any other parallels in terms of whiteness as it affects federal policy? I mean, certainly the issue of immigration and historical events of racism, the ones you mentioned. I mean, for decades they laid buried and invisible and unrecognized, and it's only the last few years, like within the last decade even, that we've had a reckoning with things like internment and the Kotaka Maru. But in terms of current day policy of federal departments, not only immigration, but just sort of any other policies as it affects people and whiteness, is there anything that you can draw on there that looks at those kinds of policies today?
I think I could speak more about, and perhaps I can actually discuss this in details when we go to our next question or topic, because I think it's very much relevant to that. But I can speak more also in terms of, and I will discuss that later on, in maybe that's one of my responses to the immigration policy, where I observed in my community, I'm speaking Filipino community, that there has been a lot of push and invitation of Filipinos from the Philippines to come to Canada through the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, or STREAM. It is to work in different service industries, especially in the prairie region. And what I'm seeing is that like why is it open only for this particular kind of skills? Like we called it low skilled stream of immigration, where people will work in the service sector. Why? What about our professionals? You know, why open a stream for academics from the Philippines, those highly skilled workers? And to me, that continues to, you know, to imagine who are the legitimate and desirable bodies within the nation state in terms of positions of power, decision making, and in terms of who can be relegated into certain job occupations. So I can draw parallel more maybe perhaps in the next round of questions.
Sure. Okay, that's great. Thanks. Over to you, Robin.
Great, thanks, Libby. Thanks, Fritz. Over to Beisan now. Beisan, in 2018, you founded your consulting firm called the New Rules, through which you helped nonprofits and institutions become more representative and resilient. And then in 2023, you changed your consulting firm's name to the New Rules, that focuses on anti-Palestinian racism. So how does whiteness relate to the work you do at the federal level?
So just to give a little context there, I was working with nonprofits, federally incorporated nonprofits, for, I guess, almost 4 years now, full time. And I always was having to do my work within the lens of whiteness. The nonprofit sector is still predominantly white representation, even though they hear a lot of feedback about how they should be more representative of the communities that they serve, even recognizing that the ability to volunteer is privilege, right? The ability to have the time and the emotional energy and the wherewithal to be able to like get on a board and do that work is not even accessible. I had to really reframe, I think, a lot of anti-racist discourse in through the lens of whiteness. And I think that what I was thinking about when I read this question was the difference between multiculturalism and anti-racism. Because when I grew up in Ottawa in the 90s, multiculturalism was the word, right? This word for inclusion and inclusivity, right? But what multiculturalism in practice led to was this system of creating model minorities, of saying, well, these are who we choose to uphold and uplift as examples of what, you know, a Canadian immigrant that we want, that we like, that we are going to kind of try and keep getting more of. This is who we like. And it creates this kind of in not saying it, in raising up some voices, it also creates these ideas of unwanted or unhelpful or unproductive citizens, right? And so that whole discourse around citizenship being about your, you know, commodification of each human being is so harmful and hurtful. But we had an entire government campaigns around multiculturalism, and it made people feel good, and it had this sense of lulling them into what was part and parcel of the colonial practice, right? Of us needing more people to, you know, fill the lands so that we have this kind of authority through population. And so recognizing that, and recognizing that even the government themselves have shifted from the language of multiculturalism to anti-racism kind of shows that even they understand what multiculturalism created. I don't think that they have necessarily adopted anti-racism by any means, but even just in this language shift we're seeing at the federal level, an acknowledgement almost of the harm of what multiculturalism as a policy, when applied without a critical lens, can actually get you, right? It gets you these kind of paper-thin representations of what a good immigrant is, right? Of what a good racialized person is. And if you don't fit into that box, you are not that. And so with my work in nonprofits, it got to the point where I was doing basically what I was complaining about, which is everything but Palestine, right? As a Palestinian woman, I was removing myself from my lessons. I was speaking in the Canadian context and kind of invisibilizing myself just to be able to work within these white spaces to kind of nudge them forward. And I think I just hit my breaking point of, if the federal government can get rid of a word that they've been using for 20 years, that doesn't mean anything. I can pivot into the new rules. So the new rules, the original name was kind of me making fun of my clients a little bit, because they kept saying, like, we don't understand these new rules. Like, we're trying to do this, we're trying to do this. People are getting mad, da, 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 da. And so I was like, oh, does it seem like all the rules changed on you? Well, okay, well, these are the new rules that you're asking about, when really they shouldn't have been new, and they shouldn't have been, to me, I think they're kind of common sense. But anyway, I have switched to anti-Palestinian racism as a core part of my work, because that's what I'm seeing is just completely absent from any kind of like discourse. The federal government in quiet circles has acknowledged that they have an absence, a total dearth of understanding of anti-Palestinian racism. And yet they do nothing to rectify this whatsoever. In fact, they contribute to extra racism against Palestinian people. I've been just horrified by the things that have been coming out of elected leaders who will say anything, really, without kind of any kind of evidence or any kind of compassion for a community that is, undergoing genocide and watching just terrible things happen every single day, right? There's no additional compassion left for Palestinians. Like, we have a compassion or fatigue right now, and there's just none for Palestinians in that government, in that federal government. And so where I see this going is the fact that so many people right now are discussing Palestine, but in a way that also links it to Indigenous resistance movements across the world, in terms of Indigenous solidarity movements, in terms of Jewish solidarity. Like, people are talking about intersectionality in ways that they don't even recognize that they're talking about it. So it was just about recognizing that there is such a need for lucid and kind of directed conversations on anti-Palestinianism, how it manifests here in Canada, how it manifests in policies, how it manifests in our education system, both, universities and even, school boards. So all of that is really on the table. One of the things that was really kind of missing was just a clickable, like an accessible website that just said what anti-Palestinian racism was. So we put that up, and the uptake there is massive. Like, there's a lot of people who do want to learn this and who do want to get that information. I think especially because we see so much harm coming from the federal government on these issues. So I know we'll be able to discuss a little bit more in the next question, just how that is manifesting. But I think, just to answer the shift, I think it's about recognizing DEI, all those kinds of acronyms, which I've hated this whole time, aren't really, if they're not about the system and if they're not about structural changes, they're just going to be like multiculturalism again, right? This thing that's like, okay, like Elle said, we have a Black woman who is voting in favor or against a ceasefire that could save how many, like thousands of lives if that happened. That is reinforcing like systems of oppression and global systems of oppression. We need to move past this kind of, multiculturalism into a real understanding of, well, what are the systems that are upholding these systems? How are they working together? And how do we actually create system change? And so we were talking about how when racialized people get kind of subsumed into the system, they almost become agents of it. And I agree. I've been thinking a lot about that lately, if I'm going to be honest, whether or not inside or outside these systems is the place to be. But federally recognizing that, they have the mandate to do this work, I think is very important. They've given themselves the mandate to do this work. So holding them accountable to doing that work and to coming through with actual progress, I think is basically the least that I can do and the least that I expect.
No, thank you, Beisan, for that very comprehensive answer. Does anybody have anything else they want to say on the impact of whiteness on Canadian federal politics and policy? We want to get into talking about how it affects media coverage, but anybody got anything else they want to say on that? Just while I open the floor.
Well, I mean, in general, and we're talking here in the context of, I think Israel, Gaza is so forefront, but it's not unique to this situation. That's just a very, I suppose, painful and current example. But I mean, we've seen this really, many people have commented that in this moment, we've really seen a lie or hypocrisy that underlies the notion of the West, right? That we've been told that the predominantly white West are the bearers of civilization, the bearers of international law, the bearers of order, all of these things. So we are the good places. And when we invade you, it's for freedom and we bring democracy and, we respect international law and we have to impose that on other people. And of course, as everybody has observed, if they didn't already know, this moment has really clarified, and particularly for the global South, the fundamental double standard there, which is, international law for you, but not for us. So, the fact that Canada can charge Myanmar with genocide against the Rohingya and say things like, well, it doesn't have to involve a population reduction, and then use the exact opposite argument when it comes to Palestinians and say, oh, there's no population reduction, so it's not really genocide. The reactions we saw to South Africa at the ICJ, which I commented on and got backlash for, the notion that how dare a majority Black country dare to come to The Hague. That's not for you. You are to be brought to The Hague. You are not to bring other people to The Hague. Law is not yours to use against us. It's us to use against yours. So you saw this fundamental notion, that the civilized countries control these things and your backwards primitive countries are supposed to be acted upon. And when you see that shift, we saw a huge backlash. And again, not from, your average person on Twitter, but at the highest levels, like federal politicians talking about how South Africa was acting in bad faith. But South Africa had no right to do this. Completely ignoring why South Africa, coming from a history of apartheid and occupation and racial struggle, would be in solidarity. And of course, that's not separate. We don't have to, it's not hard to see that that's not separate from our policy on Indigenous people. It's not hard to see that that's not separate from our long history of exclusionary immigration laws, which were designed to keep Canada white, explicitly so, and particularly in relationship to the United States. Oh, they have problems with racism there because they have Black people. We just won't let them in. We don't have any problems. We see this going to our border laws, from Chinese exclusion acts to Japanese internment to the deliberate, something we still do today, like going down into the States and saying to Black people, don't come here, something we now do in Nigeria and do to Roma people across the world. So these are long histories of policy that are based in these ideas of white supremacy, of our settler colonial history, and we're seeing them played out in a particularly vicious way, but also I think a particularly telling way. And many people are saying, this moment is so telling for this because we're seeing the global South really shift on this issue, and we're seeing a lot of critique coming from the global South, really exposing the countries that colonized us, that are the ones that are responsible for these long histories of violence, and then want to hold the people that weren't responsible for it as the only sufferers. So I think it's a very textbook example, but we recognize why Canada, as a settled colonial nation, is always going to be invested in empire, is always going to be invested in occupation, is always going to be invested in war, is going to be invested in border control, policing, surveillance. These are all the things that bring us peace, government, and good order, as it says, peace, good government, and order, as it says for Canada. And what is that order founded on?
All right. Thank you. All right. Just one last question before we go to questions from the audience. And I'm hoping each of you can, again, maybe weigh in on this. And that is, how does whiteness affect media coverage, especially of federal politics and elections, considering we have one coming up in 2025. So why don't we go Fritz L. Beisan?
That's a big question, actually. So thinking about media, and there are different kinds of media news out there, mainstream, non-mainstream, independent, and thinking about the nature and characteristics of whiteness, where it is seen as a field, a force field, where we are all going to be invited to participate, right? And then thinking about the intersectionality of whiteness with other systems of oppression, like global capitalism, neoliberalism, patriarchy, and that also shapes white settler colonialism. So thinking about the audience of the news and the neoliberal push of media outlets for marketability purposes. So these are some of the forces that I've been thinking about when I was reflecting on this question. So thinking about media, it's, perhaps in what way we could resist, right? I know there are some independent media outlets are really trying hard to continue to resist whiteness, to continue to provide a more balanced highlighting of news, like which news needs to be highlighted and which are not. So perhaps also continuing to resist this neoliberal market kind of push for a particular audience, like, right? So all these things, so a site of resistance for me right now, but I'm also seeing that it is also through media where we can resist, where we can also create alternative forms of discourses that continue to reveal and unveil the harms of whiteness. So I should, stop from there for now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Otherwise, we'll go to audience questions. Beisan, do you want to add anything?
Good, yeah.
I think Elle did too, if
Yeah.
Elle wants to go.
I gave a long answer last time, so if you want to go first, go ahead.
I'm thinking a lot about Palestine right now. I'm thinking about how Palestinians aren't allowed to speak for themselves, how every single interview, it's if there is a Palestinian voice, it is most often it's screaming in agony at what has just happened to them, right? Like there is so little effort right now in the mainstream media to actually humanize and, tell the stories of Palestinian people. That I think that this has been when we've talked about like the kind of pulling down the curtain of the, the global order and seeing what's actually there. I think a lot of people have also pulled down the curtain of mainstream media, and there's a lot of people my age and younger who are done with a lot of these mainstream media sources, because once you see this kind of bias, once you see the information in the lives that are worth telling and the ones that are not, it creates a vacuum of trust. And so young people right now are on TikTok, and even the whiteness of the attacks on TikTok, that it's the Chinese app, right? Which is, I believe, more to do with the threat of all of these young people actually using their voice and challenging the counter narrative of the mainstream media, and that the app is dangerous for having done that. And the the racialization of the founder, who was even questioned in front of the U.S. Congress, and they were like, "Oh, are you close with China?" He's like, "I'm from Singapore. I don't know what you're talking about," right? The level of just obtuseness when it comes to that, I think is just the perfect example of, oh, well, this can't be trusted and this is why, versus, well, young people beg to differ because they think that they can't trust media that's owned by the Koch brothers. So what are you gonna say there? So yeah, I would just say that the same way that this situation is bearing for everyone to see just how flimsy the international rules-based order is, it's also bearing just how white and unrelentingly white mainstream media and the interests that it protect are and are going to remain until it changes, until we change it, until the mainstream has changed, and so that this is not possible anymore.
And I'll say just very quickly, I believe it was an Andrew Coyne article last election that kind of exemplified these interlocking systems between white politics and white media, where he wrote some articles saying, we really need to give Maxime Bernier like a voice, because if we keep sort of suppressing these extreme racists, they might do something violent. So the way to manage that is like allow them power. And I'm like, well, doesn't this just say it also? Instead of you're acknowledging that these people are threatening and violent and dangerous, but your solution is we therefore should coddle them, because these angry white men, if you don't coddle them, they might be violent to you, but then we're not acknowledging that they're violent. So if you say, okay, so you're saying white men are violent, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we need to listen to them. So it was just such a textbook example of, racialized people, of course, are constantly framed as violent, threatening. Every word of ours is parsed. Oh, you're saying this, you're saying that. Oh, can you condemn this? Oh, you can condemn that. But then what Desmond Cole calls, the angry white majority, to which politics is directed inherently. And again, this notion of the citizen, what Stephen Harper called old stock Canadians, which is an inherent notion of a white public who everything is to serve. The mobilization of a notion of the white working class, which is seen as neutral. So people will literally say, oh, we don't need identity politics. We need to return to the white working class, as though that is not an identity, which shows you that, whiteness invisibilizes itself and sees itself as neutral and normal. And politics is always based around this mobilization of these particular narratives, and then the way the media reifies them and validates them. And we are always seen as optional extras who should vote no matter what, because it will be worse for us with the other guy. So vote for your own genocide. It doesn't matter if they give anything to your community or not. You should vote for them because the conservatives will be worse. And that's our relationship to politics, is we're supposed to vote out of fear. And if we refuse to do so, we are ungrateful, and we are the ones responsible for ushering in fascism, not the actual fascists who we actually need to coddle and listen to.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. We've got about 10 minutes or so left, and I think we're going to move on now to some questions that have come up from our audience members who are listening. And this one in particular is interesting. It's from someone who says that they are a member of PSAC, and I know we do have some American followers off the hill. So PSAC means the Public Service Alliance of Canada. So these are members who work for the federal government, part of a federal union. It's a very large group of people. So someone's saying they're a PSAC member, and I recently took PSAC's online course on advocacy and representation on workplace racism, and it didn't mention whiteness once. Should it have? Anybody want to take that on? I mean, it's sort of changing the perspective, right? Like, yes, there's lots of stuff going on about anti-racism, but what is it saying about whiteness? And is that something that should now be included?
I mean, yes,
anybody like to respond to that? Yeah.
I think in order to understand the very notion of racial categories, which are fictional, right? And can ever be changing. So, you can be racialized in one place and travel to a different place in the world and be perceived completely differently. So we know these are fictional social political categories, and whiteness also belongs to that. So I don't know that we can understand things like how race works if we don't also understand how whiteness has been deliberately constructed, that you can be admitted to it at certain points, removed from it at other points, that, race changes. So yes, I think that we always run the danger, because we talk about the impacts of racism, which are real, of using that to act like race itself is actually real and a biological category. And we know it's not. And so that gap between understanding the impacts that the perception of race has upon us, which is very real, like you can't just wave it away and say, oh, race is fictional, so therefore racism doesn't exist. Racism materially exists, but exists out of conditions that create race as a meaningful category. And if you don't understand how whiteness is also part of that and is produced and constructed, then I don't think you can really understand at all what you're dealing with when we're actually thinking productively about race, not just as a personal failing, like don't be mean and racist, but as actual systems of power.
Yeah,
Thanks.
just really quickly, just to jump on that, because I have found such a lack of actual just basic knowledge on what racism is, right? So many people still believe in biological race. And so if I say something is racist, people will say, well, Palestinians aren't a race. I'm like, well, good for you that you recognize that race is a construct, but we are racialized as Palestinian. And so therefore racism affects us. And even just that basic kind of knowledge and that basic understanding of the systems that we're talking about when we say racism is just missing. So obviously that includes whiteness in terms of racialization, because it's a part of it. And so I think any more information, any kind of more education you can get is better. Like you need more.
Yeah, just to add on that too, like my response would be, of course, you have to. It's not imposing, but it's one of those practices of naming, where we can't we might not be able to unpack it if we don't name it. So we have to name it. The big elephant in the room. As much as we want to name whiteness, we also want to name heteronormativity. We want to name the binary systems of gender, right? We want to name all those other systems of oppression that continue to shape settler colonialism and how we are implicated and invited to participate into these systems.
Thank you very much. All right, we have another one. Says one of the panelists said that the Irish weren't always considered white. So were they like Black people?
Well, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, if you look at the early history of like New York City, for example, you could draw analogies. There were ghettos and very segregated areas. They were denied labor. They were denied economic opportunities. There were like instances of actual like outright, racism on the streets. Like it was quite bad. But obviously, in the U.S., you can't take that and lose the entire context of African American history within slavery. So no, they were not like Black people. I'm just saying that they were not considered white. And that has to be recognized, that colorism does not come into play in this equation. It's not that.
And in fact, there's long histories of the Irish initially taking common cause with African people. So we have histories of co-rebellions between indentured Irish laborers that recognize their common condition with Africans. And part of the mobilization of whiteness is particularly this idea that one way you break that solidarity is to say, you don't have anything in common with that African American, you are white. So therefore, your allegiance should be to the elite white classes and not to the people with whom you actually share a condition, which is the brown and Black people of the world. And this is precisely what is the point of racialization. So that the Irish, as a colonized people in Ireland, who were starved by the English, who have a long history of extermination by the English, become white. And it doesn't mean that people couldn't recognize how they looked. We're not talking about physical looks. We're talking about like functionally, politically. And many people have written about how the Irish kind of progress into the white class in return for that rejecting solidarity with African Americans and adopting solidarity with the ruling classes instead. And this is why we still see vestiges of stuff like paddy wagons fighting Irish, like we still see the vestiges of that racialization the way we talk about like drunken Irish.
Yeah. Fritz, did you want to add anything? Or if not, we can go on to the next question. We've just got about 5 minutes left, so we're going to start wrapping up soon. Anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just a quick note, like, thinking about also whiteness is a form of respectability and how those concepts collide and combine with each other to think about who are considered to be respectable subjects of the country or nation. So in the analysis of Irish people and their history, we think about how they become, an antithesis to white British colonial respectability, and how they kind of like deviate from that expectations of whiteness and respectable white people. So
yeah, okay, thanks. I'm just going to come back to Elle for a moment. You were recently barred from speaking with the clerks of the Supreme Court of Canada. I think that was actually there was a story on Rabble about it, actually, so it was covered very well. And it was meant to be a discussion. Well, you were banned from it because of your pro-Palestinian advocacy, and you were going to be discussing anti-Black bias in the justice system. So, I mean, that was quite an incredible experience, given that this is the Supreme Court of Canada, which has often, you know, rendered very fine decisions. So to have that sort of discussion with the clerks somehow banned, and that you can't be in on it. I just wonder how you feel that we can respond to examples of bias like this that are coming from our fundamental democratic institutions in Canada.
Well, yeah, and I mean, what this really exemplifies is, of course, the ties between things like anti-Blackness and anti-Palestinianism, like how easy they're mobilized, and also the kind of punishment and discipline that is placed upon us as Black people, in particular, when we exert solidarity with other groups. That is particularly threatening. It's South Africa going to the court. It's seen as threatening. There's particular ways. I think it needs to be pushed back on, in that I think it's very dangerous that a court that purports to hold up the democratic value of free speech in their rulings, but then surveys your social media and determines what you can and can't say inside and outside the court. A small number of members can determine that for everybody. B, mobilizes a narrative of unsafety that now says that ideas that make people uncomfortable or that they disagree with or therefore should not be heard. And that should be disturbing, coming from lawyers whose entire job is presumably to hear opposing arguments. So it says something about our law schools and that kind of education. The notion of unsafety being applied to Black people is particularly racist, of course, like the notion that our mere presence is somehow threatening. It has, of course, implications for the kind of rulings that this court is called upon to make. And again, we like imagine that part of whiteness is objectivity and rationality, right? Like only their systems are capable of, you know, neutrally judging, but then you see these extremely biased kind of decisions being made. And I don't think that we can pretend that won't have an effect on how the court might rule and how they see. So we should be very concerned that this highest court, not supposed to exemplify justice and the ability to have argument heard, has literally said, but not this speech and not from these people. So people should be very concerned, not because it happened personally to me, but because of what it represents around speech, around suppression, and then the willingness of the court to make evidence-free claims that are based upon what Desmond Cole has called white supremacist improv, which is that you never provide any evidence and then just leave it open. So they said things on social media, and now you see people saying, well, you're not allowed to say hate speech, you know, as if you were ever accused of hate speech. No one said there was hate speech, but now it's like I engaged in hate speech and that's why I was banned, because they left open an inference, and it allows people to fill it in with whatever they please to imagine. And that is why you will always get an evidence-free claim, and they will never provide evidence, because then they would, of course, know that there's no evidence to be provided. And it's a very disturbing way in how criminalization, punishment, disciplining actually happens.
All right.
Never evidence, right?
Okay. Yeah, actually, maybe we should begin wrapping up at this point. It's we're just about out of time, so I know we could probably continue for a while, but I think we've done a good job of digging into this subject. So I just really want to thank our guests today, Beisan, Elle, and Fritz, for joining us. I feel like we could just go on more and more, but so good so far. And our live political panel of Off the Hill will return next month. And as a reminder, we now have a regular day set for this series, so you can join us for Off the Hill on every third Wednesday of the month, which means our next Off the Hill will happen on March the 20th. So please make sure you get an invitation for that event by signing up to Rabble's newsletter, rabble.ca/subscribe. And as always, a really big thank you to rabble.ca for hosting events like this. It's very important that we keep events like this going, that we have open discussion, that we learn from each other, and we stimulate discourse, which is what we try to do at Rabble. So please consider supporting Rabble by making a one-time donation, or better still, a monthly donation at rabble.ca/donate. So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you next month on March the 20th.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.